1999 The Podcast is a production of the Cage Club Podcast Network. For more podcasts on movies, comics, and all things pop culture, head to cageclub.me. To contact us with questions, comments, or just to say hi, send us an email at 1999@cageclub.me. You can find me on Twitter at probablyrealjb and Joey at soulpopped. And you can follow the show on Twitter at 1999 The Podcast. To support the show, please subscribe, rate, and review wherever you listen to podcasts. The show is written, produced, and edited by us. Welcome to 1999 The Podcast. I am John Brooks.
And I'm Joey Lewandowski. John, this is our season finale.
The finale! Yeah, well, I mean, we're going to be back
with there's no downtime between seasons, right? We're just going to, but season finale.
Season finale.
End of an era.
Yeah, end of round one.
Here's a question for you that we did not talk about. Yep. Do you think we're going to have a better season on average than this season ever?
Because we
had, I think, objectively, 7 movies at least good and 2 very bad, troubling movies. So there's room to grow, but we also chose this one because these are the big movies.
I don't think any of them, it's hard to say. Tough, because right? A lot of the movies on this first round are ones that I think this one's the one I'm most emotionally connected to, that
interesting. Oh, I forgot that Phantom Menace is in here, so maybe 6 good movies and 3 not good movies.
Yeah. Well, I love Phantom Menace.
I know you do. I know.
Yeah. No, I do. I think we're going to have, I think our next round is going to be more fun for us, honestly.
Because some of these, again, not that I'm complaining, because we watched at least 5 of the best movies of all time, I think. But some of these felt a little bit like homework in that the length or whatever, right? Or just the subject matter or any number of factors. If we take off our critical glasses and just put on our popcorn glasses, there's room for improvement.
It would be easy to do a round of 9 and just gerrymander them so that, they're all awesome. We could do that.
Yeah.
I don't think we're gonna on purpose. I don't think we're just gonna have an awesome season. Maybe, I don't know. We'll see. But it's totally easy and possible to do that. I think the way that we're sort of going to structure each of these lists, I think we're going to have a better season than this. But, I love Eyes Wide Shut. I just have a hard time watching it. I love The Matrix, but as you know, I love the second one more.
Because you're a weirdo.
I am a weirdo. We'll see. But today's is one that I think you and I both have strong sort of positive feelings about.
Yeah.
Let's get to it. Today's movie stars, I'm going to have to take a deep breath here because it's a long list. Tom Cruise, Julianne Moore, Jason Robards, Melora Walters, Philip Baker Hall, John C. Reilly, William H. Macy, Philip Seymour Hoffman, Alfred Molina, Louis Guzman, and just a whole bunch of other people. Written and directed by Paul Thomas Anderson and featuring the music and I guess the dialogue sometimes of Aimee Mann and John Bryan, released in select theaters on December the 17th, 1999. Today, for the final movie in our first round of 9, we are discussing Magnolia.
And this is not the first time that you and I have talked about Magnolia.
It is not the first time. We talked about it for Cruise Club years ago. Who else was on that? Was it Tobin?
So it was with Mike Manzi, obviously, and Tobin was on there. Yeah, because I think Tobin did both. If I'm right in saying, I think Tobin did both Magnolia and Eyes Wide Shut, which is obviously the 2 movies we talked about on this show, the 2 Cruise movies from that year. But yeah, you were on Magnolia with us and Tobin. And who was it? Tobin who had never seen it? Because one of us had never seen it, and I couldn't remember who that was. I think
it might have been Mike. I'm sure Tobin had seen it.
Because Mike said he had seen it once, but I don't know. Maybe he's rewriting history. I don't know. I was
going to ask Tobin if he had a film review from his newspaper that we could look at, because I'm sure if he did, it's amazing.
I'm excited to get to the actual episode. We don't always record the intros before the episode. We're doing it this week, but I'm excited to get to the when was the first time you saw this, because I have a fun, very vivid memory of when I might have told it on that podcast. I don't remember, but I have a very vivid memory of the first time I saw this movie, where I was, who I saw it with, and what happened. So we'll get to that, when we record the episode.
If you did tell that story, I also don't remember you.
I mean, it's not like a story. It's not like I saw it with Paul Thomas Anderson and Tom Cruise in Quentin Tarantino's private screening room. It's not like that.
I was one of the frogs as an extra. No, yeah, okay, cool. I look forward to that. So Joey, what's Magnolia about?
I thought about this the entire 3 hours I was watching this movie, because I knew this question was coming, and I can sum it up with coincidence and connection over the span of a couple hours. That's all. I mean, what isn't it about, really? Like, it's about so much. It's, a 3-hour sweeping epic covering about a dozen main characters and the way that their lives intertwine with one another. But I think it's just coincidence, connection, and, empathy. And also Paul Thomas Anderson working out some serious daddy issues.
Yes, I think daddy issues is a good way to say what it's about. Yeah, you can't. There's no real plot to this movie. It is very much like it's like saying, what's Pulp Fiction about? It's like, well, which story are we talking about? Because you pick one, and you can sort of say what it's about. But thematically, it's about a bunch of people who are in some way connected, either familially or kind of by coincidence, right? Whose lives intersect at this kind of pivotal moment in the narrative. And it is a movie that is kind of about the way that no man is an island, that everybody, there's sort of intergenerational scars and trauma, and that you can't just sort of self-help your way out of those scars and trauma.
I'm bummed it's not streaming anywhere. Like it was supposed to be on Paramount Plus. It's not on Paramount Plus. Like, you have to pay to rent it, which is not the worst thing in the world, because, like, bang for your buck, you get it with this, if nothing else, in length alone. But it feels like the kind of movie that, like, should be available somewhere, right? Even if it's on, like, a niche streamer or something, it should be out there, because people should see it at least once.
All right, here are some facts about the film itself. Much like Fight Club, it was a box office failure, probably in a slightly higher magnitude, although we're not talking about the same sort of budget. Magnolia cost $37 million to make. It made $48 million worldwide and $22 million domestically. So it lost quite a bit of money in the domestic box office and just barely made money globally. At 3 hours and 8 minutes, it's also the longest film on our list so far. And while the film doesn't feel indulgently long, Anderson himself was once asked in a Reddit AMA what he would have done differently, and he replied, quote, "Chill the fuck out and cut 20 minutes.
Well, what's annoying, and we'll talk about it, is that there's stuff in here that he left in, that he cut out other parts that don't explain things that he left in. I'm like, guy, what are we doing? Either add more or cut some stuff out.
Yeah, I agree. And I don't, like, I never feel this movie is, like, I don't think of it as being long. You know what I mean? Like, I don't see the 2 VHS tapes when I think of Magnolia. It doesn't feel like it's 3 hours long. I guess in some way it does, but, like, it's not tiring, and it's not sort of, it's well paced. And I think the sheer number of characters and plot lines kind of justify that running length. And I also don't know if Anderson had cut 20 minutes, if that really would have made that much of a difference when you're dealing with 2 hours and 50 minutes versus 3 hours and 8. But I think more to the point, I think he threw the 20-minute number out there as sort of a way of saying, yeah, it's too long. I'd have cut it down more and edited it down more.
But... Well, that's the thing. Like, and I'm sure we'll probably talk about this in the episode again, but, like, he is such a high-profile, successful, artistic, accomplished, good director that it's like, how do you rank his movies? And I think, like, objectively, like, I don't know if I like his newer stuff more than some of his older stuff, but, like, I think, like, unquestionably, like, Phantom Thread is a better movie than this. Like, Phantom Thread is just, like, incredible. Like, I don't know if I like it more, but I think it's like, in terms of, like, his ability as a storyteller, he has grown and evolved and become just better at what he does. Because this is, like, a whole, like, every movie is 23 years ago, right? Like, this is a long time ago that he's made a half dozen movies since then, and he's just become better at it. I mean, not to take anything away from this, but, like, this being his, third movie, right? Like,
third movie.
yeah.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. No, I totally agree with what you said. I actually haven't seen Phantom Thread, but I would say the same thing about like There Will Be Blood, right? That obviously, like, There Will Be Blood is basically a perfect movie. Just sort of like, technically speaking, like, there's nothing bad about that movie whatsoever. It just, everything about it is firing on all cylinders. Um, do I like the sort of like weird flaws of Magnolia that give it sort of some of that charm? Like, I think I do. I think that's kind of what you're saying. That sometimes the sort of emotional connection that a movie has is where you kind of see some of
sure.
the big swings and sort of see the director sort of take risks. And boy, howdy, does this movie do some risk taking and boundary breaking. And we'll get back to that in a second. But either way, the film was nominated for dozens of awards, including 3 Oscars: Best Supporting Actor for Tom Cruise, Best Original Screenplay for Anderson, and Song, Save Me, for Aimee Mann. It won none of them. Cruise did win the Golden Globe in the same category, and the film was received some awards for its ensemble, as well as for the performances of Philip Seymour Hoffman and Julianne
Was
Moore.
he nominated? I'm sure we talked about it then, but was he nominated for lead for Magnolia or not Magnolia, for Eyes Wide Shut, and supporting for this, or was he not really nominated for Eyes Wide Shut? Because it's rare. Like, that right now for the Emmys, Sydney Sweeney is nominated for both. I think supporting, like, limited series, and like she's got like two different. Like, she could win 2 different acting, and it's so rare that like someone is able to not only just put 2 things out in the year that they're good at, but like in different categories. Like, because generally, if Tom Cruise is in a movie, he's not going to be supporting, right? He's going to be leading. And if you're a supporting guy, you're not usually going to be a lead. So like, it's so rare to have 2 movies in the same year that obviously he's great in both, that he could win both.
Mm-hmm.
But
Eyes Wide Shut barely received any awards.
that's what I thought
It
I
was
remembered. Yeah.
nominated for the Golden Globe for Best Original Score, and that's about it. Cruise did not receive any nominations for any award. Nicole Kidman received 1 nomination from the Satellite Awards, and that was it. So, we talked about on our Eyes Wide Shut episode that it is a movie that was um, not properly received when it
Right.
came out as the masterpiece that we both kind of agree that it is today. Uh, Philip Seymour Hoffman and Julianne Moore, by the way, both had, like Cruise, stellar 1999s, and we'll talk more about their movies, the other movies that they did in later episodes. But this sort of capped off a great year for both of them. This is also a confusing movie. 2 '99 movies had both Philip name names in them. Philip Baker Hall and Philip Seymour Hoffman were both in this, and Talented Mr. Ripley. And this is around the time that they were both sort of becoming these sort of, I mean, Philip Baker Hall obviously much later in life, but they both had sort of become these sort of indie darlings. Like, there was this whole sort of cult of fandom around both of those actors as like great character actors, and it's just interesting that they would both collide in this movie, which is
Yeah, and
about
I will say, shout out to another show on the network that is obviously ended because they finished the work, but P.S. I Love Hoffman, the Philip Seymour Hoffman
yeah,
podcast, like his work with Paul Thomas Anderson basically catapulted him from like character actor to like, indie leading actor. Like, I don't think he ever, like, he's obviously bigger
yeah,
supporting in like movies like Hunger Games and whatever, but like it's his work in these movies that made him like, oh, like put eyes on him in a really big, like he was a thing before this. Like, he was on Twister and stuff like that. Like, people knew him,
sure, yeah,
but
yeah,
like
yeah.
this, like, especially him, I'm not as familiar with like the Phil Baker Hall trajectory, but I know that,
Yeah,
Nicolas
Baker Hall was
Cage.
like one of those great kind of renowned actors who I think Anderson kind of dug out and gave him sort of a late third
Yeah, that
act
makes
of
sense.
his career, which is very cool. He just died recently. He was a fantastic actor, and I loved him
Well, it feels
in
like,
pretty much everything he did.
not to sort of derail or to redirect or whatever, but it feels like guys like Tarantino and Paul Thomas Anderson who like
Yes,
love film will also be
yeah,
like, yeah, why is this actor not in everything? Like, let me just put him in
right,
like not a small
right,
role, but like put him in my
right.
thing, and then people are like, oh yeah, he's great. Where is he? So yeah,
I was going to say that about Tarantino. It's like one of the things I really like about Tarantino is his ability to be like, this guy should
yeah,
be back in movie. I mean, when you think about where Travolta was at the time of Pulp
hmm
Fiction, I mean, that's like 2 careers ago for Travolta, but he had faded into obscurity, and he's a guy that Tarantino loved and was like, put him in this movie, and then he had his sort of really, I mean, I think that his real career was the one after Pulp Fiction, up until pretty recent years. But anyway, that's separate conversation. We're going to talk about John Travolta some more in the podcast again at a later date. Magnolia remains strong with critics with a 77% Metacritic rating and an 83% Rotten Tomatoes score. The New York Post's Lou Lemonick called it the best movie of the year. Peter Travers called it one of the best. And in an ecstatic review, Roger Ebert, who reviewed the film twice, once in 2008, and awarded it 4 stars both times, said, quote, Magnolia is operatic in its ambition, a great joyous leap into melodrama and coincidence, with ragged emotions, crimes and punishments, deathbed scenes, romantic dreams, generational turmoil, and celestial intervention, all scored to insistent music. It is not a timid film. Paul Thomas Anderson here joins Spike Jonze, David O. Russell, and their master, Martin Scorsese, in championing an extroverted self-confidence that rejects the timid postmodernism of the 1990s. These are not movies that apologize for their exuberance or shield themselves with irony against suspicions of sincerity. So that's what Roger Ebert had to say the first time. The second review, he's sort of like, it's interesting because he goes back and he's like, I kind of was wrong the first time I reviewed this movie, but it's still amazing.
Interesting.
So he has like a different amazing. It's worth reading both of them, but he loved this movie. And our old nemesis, David Edelstein, who has been so harsh on so many of the movies that we love this season, openly praised the film, especially the cast, about whom he says, quote, the actors are great, all of them. It seems unfair to single anyone out, but I loved Riley's unsettling combination of sweetness and prudery. Unsettling because he's just the kind of earnest, by-the-book cop whose wheels move too slowly in a crisis. Between tantrums, Julianne Moore opens and closes her mouth like a fish that's slowly suffocating at the bottom of a boat. And who would have expected a real performance from Tom Cruise? Anderson takes everything fake in Cruise's acting, the face-pulling, the too-quick smile, and turns it into the character's own shtick, so that when the mask is pulled off, you get a startling glimpse of the rage and fear under the pose, which I think is a really, really interesting way of describing.
That all feels like a very backhanded compliment to like most of those actors.
Yeah, I mean that's kind of the way Edelstein is, right? He is I think he's a great critic. I think he's a great writer, and I always enjoy reading him. I think he's wrong about a lot of movies, but he always starts with the assumption of like everything's bad, and then kind of works backwards. So when he praises something, you kind of know he means it, even when it's kind of backhanded. But I think with Cruise, if you think about sort of where his career was, right? These two movies that we've talked about this season. With Cruise, like he was in a transition state. Like this was the year that kind of proved him as a genuinely great actor, and it is true that like a lot of the thing that Cruise kind of thrived on for a long time was the artificiality of a lot of like his performance. Like as part of what kind of made it great that he would like make this face that he's always hiding something behind. But here, I think Anderson kind of pulls that face down and shows us like the real person underneath, which is what's so sort of, I don't know, memorable about this performance that he should have won an award for, or should have won the Oscar for.
I will defend. I think he was great in a handful. I mean, he was obviously known as like an action guy or whatever, or
Right.
an 80s hunk, but he was in a handful of great movies in really great roles up until that point. And this is also like, keep in mind, he's only might be very heavily in quotes. He's only made like 40 movies in his career, and this is like capping the first half of his career off. So it's not like he had been in like 60 movies or whatever. He was in 19 movies up through 96, and then takes 2 years or whatever to shoot Eyes Wide Shut, and does this in the interim. But like, he's only made, I'm just looking at our Cruise Club episode list, like he's only done like 42-ish movies, and this is like right in the middle. So like he's and before this we have Born on the 4th of July, we have Color of Money, we have Rain Man, we have Far and Away, which is good, we have A Few Good Men. So like he was great in great things before this. It was just that he was also in like things where he was just shirtless and just dancing around in his underwear.
I agree, but there's this thing. So like, if you think about like ancient Greek theater, right, and the idea of like mask wearing, and like Cruise has always been a really good mask wearer, and I think and it's interesting too because Eyes Wide Shut uses masks, right?
Mm-hmm.
I think what's so sort of different about these two performances that I think is what Edelstein's getting at here is that here Anderson recognizes that there's this like real intensity behind Tom Cruise that he's often, even in his really great performances, like shielding behind a sort of performance mask. And that's not to say it's a bad performance. It's to say like that's part of how he goes about doing something.
Sure.
And here he like makes that performance mask like the character. And then there's this other character who that character is mask. We'll talk about this when we talk about the movie. But like, I get what he's saying, and I think this year and these two movies are definitely a turning point in the way that people saw Cruise as an actor. I think, even if that's like not fair, because I mean, yeah, like even in Jerry Maguire, he's brilliant in that movie, and I think he deserved an Oscar for that movie as well. But I love him, and you know that. So anyway, not everyone's on board with the great reviews, however. But even the worst reviews, like the Dallas Observer's Robert Wolanski, who called the film, quote, a brilliant piece of garbage, acknowledged that Magnolia takes very, very big swings, and even the best acknowledge that as a result, it's sometimes something of a mess. But if you've been paying attention to the last couple decades of the Magnolia discourse, you may well have noticed that so often a person's opinion of the film hinges on one single scene. The most absurd and audacious of the film, which is saying a lot since this is a film that features a literal biblical plague of frogs, I refer, of course, to the Wise Up scene, in which many of the characters find themselves singing along to one of the many Aimee Mann songs that litter the soundtrack. If you hated the scene, it probably killed the movie, and if you loved it, then you probably think the movie earned that moment, and that it was essential, which of course it absolutely was.
Yeah, spoiler, it's the best scene in the movie. It's not even close.
Okay, we'll talk about that as well when we get to the episode. I love the scene. I love the movie. I don't think it's the best scene in the movie, but I do think the movie earns that scene and that it's absolutely essential to the movie. But again, we will pick up that conversation. But would you agree that basically, I mean, in my conversations with people over the last couple of decades, this is what I have noticed, right? It's like, how do you feel about the Wise Up scene? And if you hate it, you hate the movie. Has that been true of you as well?
I don't really talk about this movie with a lot of people. I think, the people that I talk about this with are just like Paul Thomas Anderson diehards that love everything he's done. And we talked about it on Cruise Club, but just, I think I would say that they're probably very much linked, or it's like, it's that, or the other maybe best part of the movie. If you can get past frogs falling from the sky, then you're on board, right? But if people are like, I don't, no, that's not for me, then it's like, all right, then the movie's probably not going to be for you.
I agree. One of the things that made Magnolia a mess, and again, I don't say that critically, is that it was at least in part envisioned as an adaptation by Anderson of the songs of Aimee Mann, and insofar as the weird and miraculous and rawly emotional world of Magnolia occupies the same psychological space as the world in which Mann's songs exist, it is. In the soundtrack's liner notes, Anderson waxes poetic about Mann's work, saying her lyrics seem to be plucked directly from the subconscious, that she writes what we're all thinking, even if we don't know we're thinking it. And he even tried to shoehorn some of her lyrics, like the opening line of her song Deathly, Now That I've Met You, Would You Object to Never Seeing Each Other Again, which is loosely spoken by Melora Walters' Claudia after she meets John C. Reilly's Jim. Either way, loving Mann's music sure helps a person love Magnolia. And the film even features an original song, the Oscar and Grammy-nominated Save Me, for which Anderson directed the music video, which features much of the cast. And then, of course, there's the frogs and the religion angle, and all the stuff that we're going to get to in this week's episode with our guest, who today, Joey, is...
Our guest today is a senior editor at Relevant Magazine, whose favorite it's spoiling. You give me a line to read. This spoils one of my questions. I guess we'll get to it.
Yep.
Senior editor at Relevant Magazine, whose favorite 1999 movie is Magnolia, Tyler Huckabee.
Yeah, Tyler listed Magnolia. Recently, the thing went around Twitter that was like, your favorite movies that end in 9, and Tyler said Magnolia. So we know the answer to that question. We'll have to answer.
That's actually, I don't know if you've done this yet. If maybe you did you should look through the quote tweets of that, find verified people or journalists, and log them on a list.
Maybe I've started.
I would imagine you probably did.
So we know what Tyler's favorite movie is of that year. We'll have to ask him for his second favorite. And Tyler's actually coming to us from Paris. So we're going international for the first time on the podcast. So very exciting.
Very cool.
All right, we'll be right back with Tyler to talk about Magnolia. Welcome to 1999, the podcast. We are delighted to have you. And do you want to do a little introduction of yourself? We sort of very broadly introduced you in the opening, but if you want to tell people what you do, that'd be great.
Sure. My name is Tyler Huckabee. I'm currently in Paris. I'm sort of living expat life for now in Paris, France. I'm the senior editor of Relevant magazine. I've been there. My most recent stint now. I've been there for about 3 years, and that's really about it. That's the extent of my. It's a short bio. I was like, I need more. I don't have a whole lot of education bona fides to throw out there. There's no buildings named after me. I don't have. There's no, there's no published books for you to go check out. That's it. I've got a name. I've got a job, and I'm living here right now.
It's more than most people have.
If anybody's unfamiliar with Relevant, can you kind of explain what it is?
Sure. Relevant magazine is a publication that began, I should know this, I think in 2003. That covers the intersection of faith and pop culture. So film, movies, music, TV, anything that we feel like veers into the faith sphere for us that is interesting from a Christian perspective is something that we're interested in covering, whether that's explicitly religious or whether that's related to Christian principles and ethics or justice work. We like to try to find those angles. And we have a quarterly publication that you can go check out at relevantmagazine.com. And of course, there's stuff every day on the website. And you can find us on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and all those places too.
I think today's movie kind of fits neatly into the model that you just described.
For sure.
Would you say it's relevant to the model?
I would say it's relevant. Yeah. I would say I feel like this is Magnolia is sort of I feel like it's kind of a gateway drug for a lot of maybe elder millennial / younger Gen X folks who came across it as a sort of a theological treatise in the pop culture sphere. Does that make sense? Especially for the film bro community, it feels very like you kind of get Magnolia pilled at some point, and it takes you on an interesting journey.
Yeah, well, Joey loves to say that he enjoys films and television shows that are about religion but not about religion. So
The Leftovers, The X-Files.
Yeah. I feel that there's a term we use internally, or people use it. We didn't come up with it, but I know it's used internally in some places, even in big studios, called BDCs, beer drinking Christians. And it's like, well, this appealed to the BDC. They're like Christian. They like Jesus. They maybe they go to church, but they're not going to go see God's Not Dead. There's a distinction there, and there's not many of them, but they buy movie tickets, and I think this is a big one. This is a big one for that crowd.
I worked at BeliefNet for a time back in the day, so I am familiar with that subgenre pretty intimately.
Yeah.
So one of the things, first of all, I gotta say, because we kind of spoiled it in the intro. Towards the end of the show, we asked people what their favorite movie of 1999 is, and we already know that in your case, so we're gonna have to augment that question.
Okay, that's
but the way that we start the show is we ask our guests and then each other our first experience with Magnolia, which often gives away sort of the generation that the guest comes from. But we'll start with you then, Tyler. What was your first experience with Magnolia?
I was thinking about this, and I remember it pretty well, actually. I believe I came across Magnolia back remember when before Netflix was Netflix, you could do those 2 or 3 DVDs at a time in the mail. They'd send you, and then you shipped them back. So I was living in Chicago at the time. And I ate that up. I didn't see anybody. I didn't eat. I didn't sleep. I just was sending Netflix DVDs in and out, and this was one of those, I think. So this probably would have been 2005 or 6. So it'd been out for a little while. And I had never seen a Paul Thomas Anderson movie, but I was familiar with this one by reputation. And so that is when I came across it. And I just remember kind of having a real moment with it, probably in a way that made me sound kind of insufferable to my friends at the time. But it really made, like, I didn't know there were movies like this. Like, I was
Yeah.
not familiar
Yeah.
with the plot structure of it, the multiple interconnected stories, obviously a lot of the really big swings that I'm sure we'll get into, just narrative wise and plot wise, that you don't see coming. I've really felt like when I watched this movie, like I was seeing color for the first time. I was like, oh, like
Mhm.
I was like 7 or 8 years late to all my friends being like, have you guys heard of this movie Magnolia? And they're like, the one that was nominated for Oscars like 5 years. Yeah, I think people knew about it, and I sounded a little lame, and I was, but it really was. It was a pretty big deal to me at the time, and holds a pretty special place in my heart because of it.
So you missed it when it came out. How old were you when it came out?
Let's see, 99. So I would have been at like just 17 or so, 16, 17,
Okay.
something like
All
that.
right. So you're
So he was
between me
just
and Joey
17, if
then.
you know what I mean.
Yeah.
Middle school,
Yeah.
kind of. Beatles were singing about Magnolia, right? Seeing Magnolia in the future. That's what that song's about.
I think
That's a
that's
yeah.
the point. Yeah.
17 seems like pretty kind of wheelhouse age for being into Paul Thomas Anderson and seeing this movie and sort of having the, especially for I think someone of your kind of philosophically minded
Uh-huh.
persuasion. Like why did you miss it the first time?
I think probably because I really, there's two wolves within me, and one is like a very high minded, like important, capital I, important film lover, and the other just like wants to watch like Marvel movies and Star Wars stuff. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like
Yep.
I really, I exist in both of these worlds, but I think in high school it was tilted way more towards I was just kind of watching whatever was on. I really
I
wasn't
gotcha.
seeking out. That wasn't really the kind of home that I was raised in. I was way more interested in books at the time, and film that wasn't as much of an interest of mine through most of high school, which is why when this Netflix thing, when I realized like, oh, I could just like order whatever movies I want to, and there's nobody to stop me. This was part of my like a big education for me of just catching a lot of these kinds of movies and classic stuff and things that I had missed because I was mostly watching like Spider-Man and X-Men, stuff like that. So
Yeah.
it was
Yeah.
so it was when I say Magnolia pilled, I mean that this was also an introduction in many ways into a different type of movie that I've been watching. Not like Magnolia is some like it's I'm talking about this movie like it's a extremely highbrow, very hard to watch, very inaccessible. It's none of those. Tom Cruise is in the movie. It's not like a hard movie to find or to watch, but it wasn't the kind of movie that I was watching at that time.
Sure. Yeah. And we said in the intro, like it didn't do well in the theater at all.
Exactly. Yeah.
It was
Yeah.
a giant sort of box office bomb, but it does have, like we also talked about Fight Club a couple weeks ago, has a very similar kind of post theatrical resurrection of sorts to use,
Right. It had long
biblical and
legs.
religious terms. It sure did.
Yeah, yeah, and I think that was it kind of. I think if this is your first Paul Thomas Anderson movie, it probably made some of his later stuff like There'll Be Blood, The Master, and certainly Phantom Thread a little bit easier to get into the headspace of because you know what
Hmm.
you know what to expect a little bit more. And those movies are probably, other than maybe The Master, more straightforward than this one is even.
Yeah, I think most of his movies like you're right, because if you just watch Hard Eight and Boogie Nights, I think this is like where Paul Thomas Anderson goes weird,
Yes. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
and going weird is sort of a thing that he then infuses into a lot of his movies, if not as sort of dramatically or sort of operatically, it's still that undercurrent. Like there's a lot of like underlying weirdness to There Will Be Blood, as much as the narrative is like fairly straightforward, right? In a way that like
Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it. This one has whereas it's chaotic energy on its sleeve a little bit more. Like you leave
right.
thinking about, like, you can identify, oh, they sang an Aimee Mann musical number and frogs fell from the sky. Like you leave thinking about the weird parts of this movie, whereas There'll Be Blood, you leave they're like, that was a weird movie, and you maybe can't quite identify even what was striking you as off about it quite as readily as you could with Magnolia.
Yeah. All right, Joey, what's your big exciting story about seeing Magnolia for the
It's
first
not a
time?
big exciting story. I was while you and Tyler were talking, I was looking back at if this was my first Paul Thomas Anderson movie, because I was a mere baby in 2000 or 1999. I'm never going to get the year right, even though it's in the
This
name of
is
the
the name
podcast.
of the podcast, Joey. It's like, shouldn't be that
I
hard.
know. Anyway, I think I saw There Will Be Blood in theaters the fall before. I remember seeing this, like I went through a phase in college, as the story is on every single one of these, where I was just getting every movie from the library that I could and watching them all at home. Like in addition to Netflix, it was the library, whatever. And I remember watching this with my best friend from growing up and my mom and my dad in our living room. And I remember we were all like, okay, this is interesting. Like, I don't know if this, my mom's always a little bit less adventurous. And then I remember the Tom Cruise scene where he comes out and like the first things he says, and she's like, I think I'm good. And she left and she went down into a different room and just like stayed there. And, me and my friend and my dad were all like, all right. And I remember finishing the movie and not understanding it because I was probably 20, which I guess is, like you guys were saying, kind of like maybe the wheelhouse. But I was just like, I don't know what this is, but I know this is something, very interesting and sort of special. And so over the next like year or so, I went out and saw, I found Hard Eight and I saw Boogie Nights, and I kind of just caught up on the other things that he put out by that point. And I remember seeing, basically everything he's put out after that, as sort of quickly as I could. But yeah, I just have a very vivid memory of like, it's not really a full walkout because it's not like we were in a theater, but I remember my mom like walking out on this movie, and like understandably so. Like that's not exactly that, the kind of movie that she would necessarily be into watching, but it's in that summer of seeing, or the couple summers in my early college years of seeing like every good movie that's ever been made, like they all kind of blur together, but this one very specifically vividly stands out for that reason.
It's not momcore. If you
No.
there was online discourse about momcore movies. In my case, and to each mom their own. But in my case, that'd be movies like Chariots of Fire. You could maybe throw Titanic in there. You could maybe throw, those movies, and that's not a bad thing. Momcore has a lot of classics in it. And I say this with all love and grace to all moms everywhere, but I just don't think Magnolia would be anybody's idea of like, I'm going to sit down with mom and pop on Magnolia and we're just make some popcorn. It'll be fun.
I think as time has gone on and she's just, watched more and more movies with like, not that they weren't watching movies before this, because this was, again, only like 14 or 15 years ago, but like, she's probably watched hundreds, if not thousands, more movies with my dad, just like sitting around, especially now that they're both retired. They're just like, hey, let's watch whatever. Uh-huh. And I don't know that he would have put this on now. I don't think this is his kind of movie anymore either. I think he was only watching it because I wanted to watch it because I had it from the library or whatever. But I think that if they put it on now, they probably either both would have bailed on it or they both would have stuck it out. I think they just sort of like, we'll get through it together or whatever, right? Like it's just... Uh-huh. So, I don't know that my friend liked it. I don't think my dad liked it. I think it was probably like a 1 of 4 success rate in there. But, I've now spent 9 hours and 24 minutes, I guess, watching this movie, or maybe more. I don't know if I've seen this 3 or 4 times, but, I put a lot of time in Magnolia. So it hit for me in some way.
So I'm the again, I am the exception here. I saw it in its limited release when it came out. So in the first weekend you could possibly go see it in the theater, which was I think the week before Christmas. I went to go see this, and I had already seen Hard Eight and Boogie Nights, so I was already a fan of Paul Thomas Anderson. I was already a fan of Aimee Mann, so this was a really big moment for me. I was really looking forward to this movie. The trailer for this movie was superb. I don't know if anybody has ever seen it.
I don't think I've seen it.
Watch it on mute right now. I don't know if I've seen the trailer.
No, you got to see it with sound because it's very there's like audio.
And I will watch it after we're done.
Yeah, great trailer. This was also like one of the things that we don't really talk as much about, Joey, is how around this time, like the art of trailer making started being sort of reformed into what it is today. But I remember it being a great trailer, and I loved his first 2 movies. And this was one of those like really, I mean, immediately I got wrapped up in this, right? Like I don't tend to fall too much in love with like a ton of pop culture or cultural properties.
No, but when you love something, you love something hard.
I do. That is true. And this was one of those things. I'm less like, I think because most people I know have seen this movie now, that I feel less inclined to like tell everybody to go see it and defend it. But Again, something else we mentioned in the intro is the argument always sort of seems to come down to the wise up scene, and we'll talk about that in a moment. But yeah, this is certainly this is one of my favorite movies of all time. It is certainly the movie that I think stands head and shoulders above everything else from '99 as well. And Tyler, you listed this as your favorite movie of '99. And it's interesting because this year was also for the kind of movie that you're talking about, the sort of intellectually tilted pop culture phenomenon sort of movie. There's a lot of that this year. So there's certainly a lot for the, what did you call it, the beer drinking Christians to choose
The
from.
BDCs, yeah. That's true. And I did when I was putting that list together that you referenced, just listing my favorite movies of every year. It wasn't necessarily it wasn't necessarily an easy choice. I did go with we spoiler alert, I did go with Magnolia, but there were a lot of good movies that came. 1999 was a really strong year for movies, as I'm sure you guys are aware.
Somebody should do a podcast about it.
But I think this one was probably this one. I don't know if anybody at the time would have picked this one to be the one that one of the maybe 3 or 4 that probably people will still talk about most from '99. You'd have to put Matrix up there too, obviously, and maybe M. Night, the M. Night's peak. But this one it's still very much a part of the conversation, I think, because PTA has stayed so much a part of the conversation, and he remains a very polarizing, interesting person in film. And Magnolia seems to be one of the ways where he really became was I'm here to stay. Went from promising filmmaker to a really important part of Hollywood filmmaking, and one of the few people who really does what he does and somehow continues to get financed for it, which is I'm glad he does, but it's a mystery.
So this is a movie that is littered with an incredible cast of incredible actors, and one of the reviews I quoted from in the intro talks about how it's basically unfair to pick one among them and pick that out. But if you had to, Tyler, is there a particular performance in this movie that you find most compelling?
Yeah, I went back and forth on it a little bit because I wonder if we might talk about this. I think that people remember the Tom Cruise performance because I think it's so unlike anything else he's done, and I almost went with I'm a sucker for the John C. Reilly performance as well, but I really do think the heart of the movie, or the storyline that most maybe encapsulates what Magnolia is about, is Phil Parma, the nurse played by Philip Seymour Hoffman. And I don't think it's Hoffman's best performance, but I think it might be my favorite Hoffman performance because it's so tender, and it is very, very, in a movie that it has a lot of hard edges, it's very, very sweet. And it seems like he kind of almost maybe to the film's detriment, states the movie's themes very explicitly a few times. And I'm really good, and I don't think many actors could carry that off without people being like, "Hey, that's the movie." But he had the ability to do that, and so that maybe is I think that's the one that I think about the most. Let's put it that way: is the Hoffman performance.
Joe, I'm going to ask you the same question in a second, but one of the things, so I asked Joey, what is this movie about? And it's very ambiguous. And you point to the Hoffman performance as being sort of the encapsulation of what the movie's about. So why does that particular character and performance sum it up? And what would you say is the thesis of Magnolia?
So I would say, and I hope, I would love for Paul Thomas Anderson to listen to this podcast. I hope that he does. I hope he's still narcissistic enough to listen to every single piece of Magnolia content that is coming out. But if he does listen to this, I hope that he doesn't call me out for getting this wrong, because I don't think my assessment of what this movie is about would be his. But I do think that this movie is about coincidence and fate. and how the structure of our interconnected lives will intersect with each other's in ways that look like coincidences but are in fact not, are part of something of grander design than we can recognize unless we have the whole picture, which is what Magnolia gives us. Now, Philip Seymour Hoffman almost says this when he calls Frank T.J. Mackey's people to beg them to get Frank on the line so that he can have a last conversation with his dying father. And he says, in one of the most audacious pieces of script that I think you could ever ask for, he starts comparing it to a movie. He tells the person on the line, you know that scene in a movie? Well, this is real life. This isn't a movie. This is real life. And you're like, well, no, this is definitely a movie. There's just no way that it couldn't pull you out, except for he just does such a good job selling that line, and it works really, really well. And so I think that what he's trying to get the person on the other end of that line and vis-a-vis the audience to understand is that I know this sounds like too crazy of a coincidence to be believed, but this is what's happening, and there is a reason for this, and we have to take this opportunity that this thing we call coincidence has served up for us, which in this case is reuniting Frank T.J. Mackey with his dying father for one last conversation.
Tyler, I'm glad you said that, because when John asked me, I said coincidence and connection. He's like, that's not enough. So I'm glad that you said it in a way that apparently I would hope appeases him. And then I summed it up as daddy issues as the follow up.
Well, I think we're swirling around the same drain here, right?
Oh, for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. Daddy issues. Definitely. I mean, almost every story in here has something about fathers involved in it, but that's Paul Thomas Anderson for you. You're just going to have to deal with dad stuff and all of this.
Yeah, and look, I mean, one of the things that inspired, I think what you have to sort of also look at is just the story of why Paul Thomas Anderson wrote this. And there's really two reasons. One, he watched his dad die of cancer, and two, he was like, I love Aimee Mann. I want to adapt her songs into a world where stuff happens. And it's sort of the weird, messy sort of finale of that, plus some Fortunism and some sort of accidental biblical elements, which we'll talk about. We'll talk about in a moment. Really quick side point here. I love. I was thinking about that trope and how much that trope both drives me insane, but also I kind of love it, of when someone in a TV show or movie points out that this is real life,
this
unlike the other thing.
Yeah.
So I've been rewatching The Sopranos lately, and the way that they talk about fake mob stuff like Goodfellas and The Godfather, and it's no, but you're also fake, and
it's such a daring move. I love when creatives do it, but you really have to. It takes a lot of confidence. I think oftentimes misplaced confidence to insert dialogue like that into your show. But I'm with you. It's easy to make fun of it, but when it's done right, it's done right, and I think it's pulled off here. And I think we could use about probably 45% less of it in other movies and TV shows.
Or Attack of the Clones, when Padme's we live in the real world. It's no, you don't. You live in Star Wars world. What are you talking about? That's not real.
Literally saying this in front of a green screen.
Right. Joey, favorite performance?
I think given my personal history, which is a weird way of saying that I did a Tom Cruise podcast, I can't not pick Tom Cruise, even though I think he's not necessarily a focal point. But I do think that what Tyler said about the Philip Seymour Hoffman, I think when they come together, I think it works really, really well, because it's such diametrically opposed, but also at least on their outside, right? Tom Cruise is so hardened, Frank T.J. Mackey is so hardened in this movie, and Phil is so soft and gentle, but he breaks down, Tom Cruise breaks down when he gets there. I think that the two of them together just works so well in a way that I will say, not to burst the absolute bubble on this love fest of Magnolia, but I think this movie wants me to like it more than I actually like it. I think I weirdly like this movie a little bit less each time I watch it, because I think its smugness kind of offends me somewhat. When it starts with the Greenberry Hill thing, I'm like, all right, here we go. here we go. And I get what it's doing, and I think it's admirable, and I love when things swing for the fences, so I'm not knocking it for that. But I think, as I was saying in the intro, I think he has learned how to make better movies, and I wonder, you mentioned that thing that, like, would he cut 20 minutes? He's like, I would do it and cut 20 minutes. I think if he recut this now, it would be a much better movie. I don't know if it would be the same Magnolia that people love, but that's to say that I think I love a lot of this movie. I don't necessarily fully, without hesitation, full stop, love everything. But I think that Tom Cruise stuff, especially given that I've watched all of his movies and, followed him through his career and the way that he interacts with Philip Seymour Hoffman, and having listened to that podcast on our network and just, knowing how his career trajectory arced, I think the two of them coming together at the central, the heart of this movie, it just works really, really well. And I don't know that I would change that if I was, not that I have ideas how to re-edit or recut this or whatever, but I don't know that I would change that at all. I think that works really well for me still.
Do you find because this is I know people talk about this a lot. Do you find the Cruise's role in this as a whole to be a pretty significant outlier to the rest of his career, at least at this point in his career in the late 90s?
I think it's like one of the big themes that we tried to, like, sort of, not themes, but like one of the things we tried to dissect on Cruise Club when we watched all of his movies was, like, you think of him as like this action star, right? And like that's what he was so defined as. And this and Eyes Wide Shut this year both were like trying to do something radically different. And I think, like,
Mhm.
he's not playing a villain here. I think he's just playing like a broken person. But like he so rarely played something that, like, wasn't truly fully admirable. Like, it might kind of just be like this in Collateral, and like that might be it.
Yeah.
And so in that
Yeah.
regard, absolutely is kind of an outlier. I think that he rose to stardom so quickly. Like, Top Gun is like his fifth movie or something. Like, it's crazy how quickly he was just like, oh no, I'm here, and like I'm never going away. And he was very good at what he did, and I can imagine you kind of get bored with that. And so doing things like Jerry Maguire and Rain Man and kind of like bucking the trend a little bit, and like then doing this and Eyes Wide Shut in the same year. And then as time has gone on, I think he's tried to, like, the thing that if you look at his career now, he's like just trying to find another franchise. Like, he really wants something in addition to Mission Impossible that he can, like, just kind of like focus on. And he was trying to do like The Mummy with the Dark Universe, and that didn't work. And he tried to do Jack Reacher, and that sort of didn't work. And I think he's, Top Gun revived, and I don't know if that's going to continue, but maybe. And he's really trying to like find something. I feel like he's sort of settled into like, this is who I am. But I do think this is an interesting pivot, this and Eyes Wide Shut both coming out in 99, where it's like he's not in crisis, but he's trying to figure out, can I be something different? And I think the answer is like yes, but I don't know that he wants to be. I think he's kind of okay
Sure.
just
Yeah.
being
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
the greatest action star that's ever lived. And I think that's
Uh-huh.
okay. But
Yeah.
absolutely, I think this is an outlier. I think he could do more of this. I just don't know if he's interested in doing more of this. Like, it seems like what he wants to do is just like jump out of planes and shit, right? Like, he wants to just like
Sure.
push the envelope. He could do more broken man sort of serious drama. I don't know why he doesn't, other than like it might not interest him.
And I don't know if I don't know if another Paul Thomas Anderson movie could afford him. Like, at this point, he was Tom Cruise at this point, but now I feel like he's a different caliber of star, even than he was in 1999. There's that legacy is just got to be expensive to a degree that people don't like to. Paul Thomas Anderson has been very open about how hard it is to find financing for his movies,
For sure.
and
And I think,
and
I think what also why he might have been able to afford him even then, I think we might have touched on this in the intro, I don't remember, is like Tom Cruise is also rarely not the leading man. Like, this is not a
right,
thing that requires 3 or 4 months of his time. Like, he was probably like a couple of weeks, maybe. Like, it's not
yeah,
like he has an insignificant role, but he's not in the movie in every scene, or he's not in it more than most of the people. Like, he's probably in it
sure.
less than most of the other lead actors. And he's probably got, maybe 2 or 3 locations. Like, there's like the ballroom and the hotel room and then the house. Like, that might be it. And I think him choosing to go to this like up and coming auteur, like, he might not be like taking his full salary, but I think it's also like it's not like Kubrick where he's taking 400 days or whatever and filming that. Like, he could probably knock
Yeah,
this out in a
sure.
week or two. And so I don't know that he could lead another, like, I don't think Paul Thomas Anderson could afford to like pay him whatever he makes now in a movie, like $20 million or points on the back end. Who knows, right? But like, I think that if he were to be in this kind of level in a movie, like, he could probably do it again. But I don't know that he wants to do that either. I think he just like the ego or the hubris or just the confidence or just the interest. It's just like, I'm going to lead the movie.
Sure.
So I'm gonna just go back to Tyler's observations. I would also rank those performances as my favorites. And I remember like the weird thing about Philip Seymour Hoffman in this movie, again, Joey, we sort of talked about this before, but it was sort of the time that his star was rising, I guess, that he was becoming much more of a sort of household name, and that the Philip Seymour Hoffman kind of role was setting in. And yeah, he doesn't do a lot in this movie, and he's not a big. He's like really kind of a background character, but also I agree, like it's the one that always sort of, I don't know, sort of like stuck around in my heart, right? Like after I saw the
Yeah.
movie. And I feel the same way also about John C. Reilly, who I really love. And I was reading a little bit about sort of how this role came about, and that Reilly, before he was known as a comedic actor, which is like really weird to say now because now he's just in comedies nonstop. He was, kind of like the lovable, sort of sometimes doofish kind of schlub. And he said to Anderson, he's like, I want a love story. He's like, I can be that character, but I want to be like the romantic lead. And Anderson was like, all right, well, let's figure out how to make that work. And it sort of fits well into, again, sort of the like Aimee Mann world that is being built here of, really just sort of everyday average people having these like very big feelings, which is sort of like a lot of what Aimee Mann's work is all about. Joey, I agree with everything you said about Tom Cruise and Tyler. I think you also make a really good point about sort of this being kind of an outlier, but I also think that like one of the things that makes Tom Cruise a great action star is that he always does have this like, he's not just sort of there doing the action, right? There is this like real intense humanity that is like seething beneath him at all times. That is part of what makes him so great. It's like what elevates movies like Top Gun and the Mission Impossible series and that sort of thing into like a different sort of level. That here it's just all raw and out there, and it's just really exciting and sort of like new to see it that way.
Yeah, and I think that there is what makes him who he is presence, is that
Yeah.
that can't look away energy that you either have or you don't. That's born. That's not they can't teach you that at Juilliard. That's just a thing you have. And I think the reason it works here is because the things that Frank T.J. Mackey is saying are very stupid, and it's not compelling content, but it's compelling because of who's saying it. And it's you
Great
can
point.
totally believe that these like lost kind of, and the film was very prescient, sorry, I never say that one right, but it's very prescient in this way, because this has become, the people like Frank T.J. Mackey have become a real, you can make a lot of cash doing that kind of stuff now, then and now, but even more so now. There's a huge strain of this that is sort of ascendant in American pop culture and in American society. And what they're saying is neither new nor interesting, but if you have enough gravitas, and nobody has more gravitas than Tom Cruise, you can really sell it. And obviously you can make a lot of money doing it if you're on the right end of it. So I think PTA saw something coming there and tapped into it, and he cast the right person to make that a believable phenomenon.
That's it's a great observation. I hadn't really thought of it that way. That I remember at the time of seeing it and thinking that it was a very sort of over the top and clever and funny parody of like Tony Robbins and pickup artists and all that sort of
Yeah,
thing.
yeah.
But now in the sort of like Jordan Petersoning of the right, it just sort of seems like the thing that someone could watch now and not see the same sort of satirical, like maybe see the hyperbole, but not the satire quite as readily.
I think that's probably true. I think at the time you had guys like Tucker Max, isn't that the name of the I Hope They Serve Beer in Hell
Yep.
guy, who was kind of a famous pickup artist, who this was probably, I think this was maybe around that time. I can't remember. This might have even predated that though. I don't have believe it or not, my Tucker Max timeline isn't super, I wouldn't say it's like concrete in my head, so I don't know for sure, but
Can I pose a sort of quick change of topics? There's something I want to talk about, and I think it goes to what we were talking about in the intro and sort of what I referenced about him making this shorter. But this movie's over 3 hours long, and there is that scene in the intro where the little kid is rapping to John C. Reilly, and he's like, "You listen to me, I'm gonna tell you exactly what you need to know." He talks about the worm and the worm and the worm, and then the worm gets cut out of the movie. And like Orlando Jones still in the credit as the worm, right? Like he's still in here. You can watch it on the DVD or whatever. But like, how are you going to have that kid, like, again, not necessarily the most memorable moment in the movie because it's probably the Aimee Mann thing or it's the frogs or whatever, but that kid rapping and the way that it's shot with like watching John C. Reilly as you're listening to the kid, like it's very memorable. And to leave in this like 4-minute interchange between or exchange between the two of them and then to cut out the worm entirely, like I get it still kind of ends up in the same point, but like, is that frustrating to you guys that like there's this whole like build up to a thing, this payoff, and we don't need it resolved to sort of show that John C. Reilly is either a good cop or bad cop or whatever. But like watching this time, I'm like, what does that mean? And I Googled like, what does the rap mean? And I'm just like, I'm annoyed by that a little bit because if you're gonna have a movie this long, like why not have like one more scene where there's, Orlando Jones in there as the worm?
I want to hear John's take. I know mine, but I'm curious. But I'm curious about. I feel like John probably knows more about this than I do.
Because I
So I'd
feel
be
like
interested to hear your take.
maybe, and John, maybe if you know more about the other deleted scenes, like maybe there's other stuff that like you
Yeah.
wish was in there too. But like that's the one thing that stands out to me. Like, why not go with that? Like, why not do that? Like, it feels like we're so close to like whatever we are. I don't know.
So when I saw it the first time, that did stand out to me, and I didn't know that there was a corresponding deleted scene and or character, right? So I always my interpretation of it was always this like weird little enigma, like a little riddle happening with the rap and the worm and whoever that was, and like maybe one of the characters is the worm, like you know what I mean? Like it was one of those things that I was like, oh yeah, that's kind of an interesting sort of weird add-on mystery that I don't understand because I'm not smart enough. And I kind of left it at that for a long time. It wasn't until much later that I knew that there was, again, an entire sort of like plot point that was deleted from the movie. But I guess insofar as like it worked for me, at least the first time, I don't mind. And I still think it's a pretty like compelling and strange little scene. So yeah, I think kind of in retrospect, I share your frustration and annoyance, but not so much that I think it was like a massive oversight to incorporate that scene while deleting the elements that it corresponds to, I guess.
I find it pretty mystifying too. I'm with you, Joey. I don't quite understand the. I would love to hear more about what went into that because I feel like, especially when you end the movie on John C. Reilly sort of confessing his love, presumably confessing his love or saying that he wants to give this a shot, and in a way making his thread sort of the center, or like I said, the heart of the part one of the hearts of this movie, and certainly the most uplifting part of this movie. To leave so much of that on the cutting room floor, I think if I feel like if PTA had this to do over, and this is going to be controversial maybe, but I say you cut out the prologue with the three intertwining stories that sort of sets you all up, and you give more time to the worm and John C. Reilly to really let that flesh itself out a little bit more. Because I just otherwise just so much of that just doesn't really make sense without the extra
Yeah,
context.
because I think also with the opening, like it's setting up like this is a thing where everybody's connected and everything there's a coincidence or whatever. But like the movie does that, and like we don't really come
Yeah.
back to that. Like I get that it also brings up like the whole Patton Oswalt brought up into the like in the scuba diver or whatever, and like the frogs.
Uh-huh.
It's like the same thing. Like I get that, but like I don't know that we need that to pay off the end. I'm right there with you. Like I think I would just excise the entire because it also like what I was saying earlier. Like I feels like that intro just feels pretentious in a way that the movie doesn't really. Like I think it is the movie is pretentious. Like I'm not saying that it's not, but I feel like that opening is especially so. Like it's just like this is like a film student view of like here's like this like this magnum opus or whatever. And I feel like it works and I get what it's going for, but it doesn't interest me because like it's sort of outside the movie in a way that like trust the movie that you're making, like trust the next 3 hours to like tell the story you want to tell. Like don't use these 5 or 6 minutes on whatever this is.
Hmm. Hmm. I think that'd be my take as well. And I like the opening. Like I think it's really well shot, and I rewatched it the other day. And I think it's a really well crafted kind of short film. but I think that, and I think it could kind of work with the visual and narrative poetry of the rest of the movie. But I think that if it came down to either having that or fleshing out the plot line of Officer Jim Curing, I think I would opt towards the latter. And I wonder if he would now too. I don't know.
Yeah.
Switching gears a little bit here, let's talk about the two most divisive and controversial scenes in the movie that I think, as again we alluded to earlier, Joey, that a lot of your opinion of this movie depends on sort of how you feel about these two
Right.
scenes.
Yep.
And one of them, I think, I would say, like, as someone who is on record a massive Aimee Mann fan and have been for a long time, ever since like Till Tuesday. I go way back with my love of Aimee Mann. I don't know how this movie hits differently for someone who doesn't already love Aimee Mann, or if this is a movie that like makes you love Aimee Mann more. So I can't really speak to like that element of it. But I will let you guys both talk a little bit about how you feel about Aimee Mann and what sort of your history with her music is. But then also, the wise up scene. And I know, Joey, that you think this is the best scene in the movie, and that Janet Maslin of the New York Times says that this is the scene that destroys the movie. And there's usually one of those two opinions that people tend to have when it comes to this movie. And if you could talk about like why you love that scene. So let's first of all, like, Tyler, I'll start with you. Are you, or were you, or have you been at any point in your life a fan of Aimee Mann's music? And does that impact the way you see this movie?
Pro Aimee Mann and pro the Wise Up scene on both counts. Yes, I'm a fan of Aimee Mann's music. Not like I'm not a diehard fan, but I appreciate her and I enjoyed her, and this movie was probably a big part of me going from like, oh, Aimee Mann, I know who that is, to being somebody who actually actively like sought out her music and was listening to her more, because I thought this scene really worked, and I didn't know when I watched this movie for the first time that was coming. I didn't know that she had inspired the movie, or had like largely inspired the movie. So it hit me like a freight train. I did not see a like a full on musical portion coming. But I loved it then, and I still love it now. And I think I have no problems with it.
I don't really have any history through Aimee Mann. I would imagine that it's the similar thing that I hear when like a Radiohead song pops up in a thing. I'm like, oh, like this makes me think a thing that I was already loving, love it even more, right? And like I'm able to pick up on things even more quickly. Like even Ozark, which is not a great show, it's just like this insane show that I'm slowly watching on Netflix, slowly catching up on. But like when it dropped like a new Radiohead song, like I think at the end of its pilot, I'm like, oh, like I think that like the blending, the marriage of like music and movies, and I think we talked about this on your other podcast on Hard to Believe when we talked to Liza about The Leftovers and the music and Leftovers. Like when you have someone using music to further enhance another medium, whether it's movies or TV, and like they have your taste, it's like, oh, this was meant for me. Because it's like you're not expecting to hear music, and then when you hear, I mean, you're expecting to hear music, but like you're not expecting like for the music to be like a thing for you, and then for like when it becomes a thing, it's like, oh, this is special. So I don't really have a history with Aimee Mann. I think this scene is the best scene in the movie. And it reminds me of the scene in Sense8, another Netflix series, where all of the Sense8s sing Four Non Blondes What's Up at the end of an episode. I'm like, this is incredible. And like, I don't know if it's a direct allusion to this or just like another thing, but like whenever you can like take 3 or 4 minutes and just like do a thing that like you probably shouldn't do, but like, when it works, it works. Like, man, I love it. Like indulge yourself, like go crazy for that. Like that just works for me. So no real history with Aimee Mann. I can see if you love her, this like elevating things even further, but absolutely the best scene in the movie.
Yeah, and I think it's fair to say, like, I think it is indulgent, but like also necessary. Like, it does enhance the movie, and it does, I think, further the thesis of the movie. And I think that's like ultimately, I don't care if you're indulgent as long as it means something and you're actually accomplishing something with the indulgence, right? It's obviously an absurd scene in in what is a movie that is just littered with like randomly absurd things in an otherwise very straightforward and heartfelt drama. But the reason to me that it works is that, again, as you guys sort of allude to, the underlying thesis of this movie being about like coincidence and empathy and like the interconnectivity of people and that sort of thing. I think it reemphasizes the idea that in in music and in popular music and in popular music about sadness, right? And a lot of Aimee Mann's music is about like sadness and disappointment. But in a way that is doesn't really matter who you are. Like she relates it to things that are, I think, very universal. And even though she often uses very kind of specific and sometimes strange narratives in her music, um, the underlying ideas are always sort of things that are relatable. And while all of these characters have been through very specific different kinds of traumas and different sort of hardships over the course of the narrative, the song makes sense for all of them in that moment in terms of what they're going through. And I think just in terms of as a commentary on like, you know, that like all human suffering is basically the same suffering, and that like every song is basically a song about, you know, the human experience. And just as a really sort of ambitious experiment to make that point, I think it is brilliant. It's not my favorite scene in the movie, but I've always defended it and said like, no, you don't have the movie without this scene.
I mean, it's emblematic of the movie. Like, if it's not your favorite scene, like it's the most
Yeah.
Magnolia scene, I think, right? Like, if on a scale of like not Magnolia to Magnolia at its core, like this is it's Magnolia.
It's definitely on that side of the scale, if we're talking about scale here, and I think I totally agree that it's an indulgent scene. But if indulgence is a turnoff for you, then Magnolia is not going to be your movie. This is
Right.
and he's probably not going to be your director. He's a very indulgent filmmaker, and this is maybe his most indulgent movie. But I think that it's also it's a pretty tender scene. Like it's very the song is very understated. They're not. This isn't Phantom of the Opera. It's a pretty song, and it encapsulates the movie's themes. And I'm glad that every movie doesn't do this, but I think this one earns the right to pull this trick, and I think it does work.
Well, Tyler, let's go more to your wheelhouse then and talk about the sort of biblical slash, you know, let's say biblical and sort of like from the Western perspective, like quasi religious elements here. Now one of the things that Anderson has said is that the initial idea for the frogs was not a reference to Exodus,
Right.
but it was a Fortean move, right?
Which
That
is so
he
strange,
uh,
isn't it? Like that because it's such I guess it just kind of maybe it's a little bit of a Rorschach painting to because if
yeah.
I see frogs fall from the sky, my first thought is, oh, Moses. But that was not on his brain when he put this in the movie, right?
Well, especially when 8-2 is just littered all throughout the movie in the
Exactly.
background, right?
Yeah.
In
Yeah.
little, right. And obviously, like when he came to understand that, I think he refocused it to be more directly sort of inspired by Exodus.
Uh-huh.
But yeah, you know, he was interested in Forteanism. You know, there's a couple of like Charles Fort books that appear like on in the background of the movie. And so the idea of like within magical realism of these unexplained paranormal things that happen that sort of overtake the narrative or that there's some kind of response to, like Joey, you know, Leftovers is a really good example of this, where the whole premise of the show is like this incredibly unlikely thing happens, like how do people respond to it, right? And that's sort of what it's exploring. So you know, then ultimately, like, yeah, it does become biblical. It does become very sort of, you know, Exodus
Yeah.
inspired,
Yeah.
with it being kind of a plague of frogs, and they are everywhere and a nuisance, and appear to be some kind of a miracle. So yeah, what is your, like, if you're going to write a think piece about
Yeah.
sort of the way that Magnolia is inspired and or reinforces certain kind of biblical religious ideas, like what would the premise of that piece be?
I I think that I mean I would be very wary of this because I think I would have to totally dismiss any idea of authorial intent to really sell this for like a relevant think piece or something like that. But I do
Yeah.
think that there is a case to be made that this moment, the climactic moment of the movie, finds most of these characters in a moment of deep personal crisis and or resignation. of sort of the end of their rope, a place where their personal crisis in the case of John C. Reilly's Officer Curing, interpersonal crisis with Frank T.J. Mackey, sometimes actual physical crisis like with Phil Parma. And I think that then these frogs come and they sort of throw everything into relief via an act of violence, via an act of chaos, something that is unexplainable and terrifying, and also very, very dangerous, and causes and wreaks havoc. But the next morning you have the kind of the beautiful shots of everybody emerging from underneath the pile of frogs, and it seems to have in some ways liberated them, or at least brought some relief to their moments of crisis. And so I think that if I was going to draw analogy there to what the plagues did in the book of Exodus for the Hebrew people, and how this moment of violence was ultimately the means of their liberation, I think I would probably pursue that. Would probably be the angle I would take with that. But I'm not doing that. I'm just hypothesizing here on a podcast.
I do think there's some authorial intent there, because again, like as he wrote this movie more and more, like and someone pointed out to him the
Yeah.
Exodus thing, like he incorporates that reference like into the actual movie. So you are supposed to draw some sort of parallel there,
Yeah,
otherwise
I
it
think
wouldn't
you're
be.
right. Yeah, I think you're right, and I don't want to, but I think that the criticism that people like me can get irrelevant sometimes is like trying to shove a square peg into a round hole with the Christian analogy for some of these movies.
Yeah,
So I try to be
yeah.
very careful about that, and I'm sure you're familiar with that critique as well. But I think here you can make the case, because religion is never too far from Paul Thomas Anderson's mind in many of his movies. There's often
Hmm.
at least an
Hmm.
interest there, and this is maybe the most explicit, other than The Master, the most explicit that it gets. But it's there in Boogie Nights, and it was certainly there in There'll Be Blood, and I don't know if it was there in Inherent Vice, but maybe.
I think this is going to be maybe an off-putting sentence, but I feel like whether you're a believer or not, I don't know, it's going to be off-putting too. Whatever, piss off. I don't care. Not you guys, just listeners. But I feel like for intelligent people, or people who are learned and like to read and like to explore creative things, and it feels like Paul Thomas Anderson is one of those people, whether they are a believer or not, whether they have faith or not, I feel like religion is inherently one of the most interesting things to like just frame narrative around and think about. So I don't think it's like unusual that like religion is like, I don't know if he's Christian, I don't know if he's atheist, I don't know what his affiliation or whatever is. But I just think like it tracks, even if it's not like explicitly in a movie like Inherent Vice, I think it can't not be. And I think you could be like, a religious reading of that movie or whatever is probably totally valid, because like when you make a movie like this, I think you could do a religious reading on anything else you ever do, because like it's so at the core of something like this, right? So
Sure.
even if Inherent Vice again is not about religion, it's in there somewhere in some way.
Well, yeah, and also, I mean, look, if you are from the Western world, right, like whether or not you're religious or not, like there's certain sort of theological frameworks that are just inherent within the culture. And so, like, that is what you're going to turn to, and that's what's going to be familiar and recognizable, right? So, again, whether or not Paul Thomas Anderson's like ever been to church or whatever, I don't think is relevant here. I don't think people like know that the plague of frogs thing is like from Exodus. Regardless, really, if you live in the West, like that is part of sort of your
Right,
understanding
right.
of the theological worldview. I also think like one of my readings of it is always that that sometimes, and I thought about this a lot, like since the pandemic, is that sometimes you need an absurd miracle to occur, or like some strange, unexplainable tragedy. And again, The Leftovers also deals with the same idea. To notice that other people are also suffering, and that other people also like go through hardships. And that's one of the things that like, that's the sort of, we are watching that as we're outsiders watching the movie and watching the narrative unfold, but none of the other characters are seeing that until a miracle happens where they're sort of forced to acknowledge each other, and acknowledge that like a lot of what they are experiencing is in fact the same. And like I'm ashamed to admit it, but like I have been much more aware of that since the pandemic. The idea of like how much my behavior impacts other people, and how that like we actually do have a lot of shared hardship and struggle that I didn't used to think about 5 years ago. And I think that's sort of part of why the frogs fall out of the sky as well. Like, it is a miracle, but it's a miracle that is trying to make something very simple that should be obvious happen. And like, it's not happening any other way.
And I think it's the first time that you see something, you get these snapshots of all these people whose lives are spinning around each other. They occasionally intersect and even crash into each other. But this is the first unifying thing that takes place for everybody, other than the Aimee Mann song. And that puts them all in the same. So it really does illustrate the like a collectivist perspective, where up to that point we'd been mostly been getting an individualist perspective on all of these things, and it does it
Yeah.
does like unify the narrative in a way that I don't know would have happened without it. And you're right about the COVID. I mean, I wouldn't call the Plague of Frogs a COVID analogy, obviously, or any sort of pandemic analogy, but I'm right there with you in terms of it making me sort of rethink, what do I owe the people around me, in my
Right.
community, and not just my neighbors and friends, but people I don't know, the people in my proximity.
Question, not to change the topic dramatically, but also to change the topic dramatically. If you were in a car and frogs started falling from the sky, would you just keep driving blindly? Like, it feels like everybody reacts to this very poorly. And I understand I'm not in that situation, but it feels like just driving recklessly would not be able to see feels like the wrong idea.
Have you ever
Yeah.
driven through the South, Joey? Because like, that happens, but with bugs in like certain parts of the South.
Oh, when I drove cross country like a decade ago, I did not understand. I was not prepared for the level of bugs hitting windshields, and like I got pulled over by a cop because my front license plate it totally covered by bugs being splattered.
Yep. Yep.
And I was like, oh, I didn't even think to I wiped off my windshield, obviously with the blade, like the windshield wipers, but like, so I get it, but also I don't know, it seems crazy.
To answer the question though, really quickly, in my case, I'm one of those guys who, like, I don't ask for directions. I power through. I start seeing frogs come from the sky. I'm probably like, those dang frogs again, and I just keep, I make it I make it to everybody else in the car, as far as they're concerned. This is just another day in Nashville for me. Like, what are you gonna do? If it's not one thing, it's another
Okay,
thing in this country. Now there's frogs coming from the sky. It wouldn't be true. I would be BSing my way through this, but that would probably be my reaction.
I appreciate your honesty.
Tyler, we got to let you go stroll down the Champs Elysees with an espresso or whatever it is you do over there.
That's
But
the plan.
before we go, Joey, we have to augment the first question, but we have
Yes.
a couple final questions for you for fun before we
I'm
depart.
ready.
So take it away, Joey.
So we normally ask, what is your favorite movie of 1999? But since we've already outed you as a Magnolia fan, what is your second favorite movie of 1999? Or you can answer a different question. What is your least favorite movie of 1999?
I don't know. I don't know the answer to the least.
Okay.
I couldn't tell. I don't. I haven't got. I didn't catalog. I don't have the ranking in front of me right now.
Okay.
But I think the Matrix is a really it kind of falls into the same, like, for a while it was kind of cringe, I think, to like the Matrix. You're kind of like, oh, not one of these guys. Like, it feels like a very internet Reddit bro thing to like.
Yep.
And so you had to be kind of quiet about it for a while. But I think we've been able to come around. I think we've been able to admit to ourselves as a society that the first Matrix is actually a very good movie that really captured the Wachowskis in at a peak form of craft, not just like interesting storytelling, not just a moment for Keanu Reeves to really ascend, but also just a well-made, well-handled movie that put blockbuster filmmaking forward in some really important ways. It's not their fault that Hollywood took all the wrong lessons from that movie. That's on us. We need to own that as a society. We need to apologize for that. We need to repent, but we also need to admit that the Matrix is good. It rips. It's just fun.
Yeah. So now, and the answer might be Magnolia, but do you have a favorite movie of all time?
The answer is not Magnolia. It's hot. The simple answer is probably no. I don't think I have a favorite movie of all time.
Okay.
That's a good
there's a
answer.
lot of them,
Yeah.
but what I say, the one that I kind of have defaulted to when this question comes up in conversation, that I don't even know if would be true anymore. I've just said it long enough now that it's become my go-to answer, and I will always love it. Is Pan's Labyrinth.
Oh, okay.
Interesting.
That's a very, very important movie for me that I think is absolutely Del Toro's best. and I love the creature work in it. I love the narrative of it, and that was it was just one of those where when the credits rolled, I remember where I was, what I was doing, how I was feeling, and I'm always trying. I'm always looking for that feeling again in a movie.
I remember
really
when I
love
saw
it.
that in theaters, I walked out and I saw people like consoling their significant others who were just like broken down in tears in the theater, and I'm just like, oh, okay, so this hit you a little harder, a little bit more hard, a little harder than it hit me, but also I appreciate it. So like I do really like that movie. And I was just like, oh, I need to watch this again. If like these people like reacted in this way to this, like very vivid memory of that too. So I think it's a great answer.
It's one of those that's probably what you bring out of it, like what you take out of it depends on what you bring into it in a lot of ways,
Yeah.
like not
Yeah.
just like in
Yeah,
terms
yeah.
of your taste in movies, but your life up to that point and how you feel about a lot of the themes that it has in it.
Joey, we should reframe that question from now on and say, like, what is the default answer that you give when forced?
Gun to a
Because,
head.
like, yeah, when I say Contact, I'm also doing the same thing. I'm like, well, that's just the answer I'm going to tell you right now.
Well, when I say Paddington 2, I'm not doing the same thing. I'm genuine and I mean it.
That's a justifiable, 100% justifiable answer.
Yeah.
Tyler, thanks so much. Before we go ahead and advertise your internet presence if you would so desire.
Yeah, absolutely. You can find me at Tyler Huckabee, just like the former governor, at Tyler Huckabee on pretty much everything, on Instagram and Twitter, where I'm most active. I guess those are the major two. I don't have a TikTok, so don't bother there. And you can find a lot of my writing at relevantmagazine.com, and hopefully some books in the near future, but nothing to plug there yet. So
Joey, thanks so much, and Tyler, thanks so much.
Thanks, Tyler.
hey, thanks guys, this was fun.
We'll have to do it again sometime.
Sounds good. Can't wait.
Adieu.
Always down.
That's
I'll do.
French.
But thanks a lot, guys. This was this was a lot of fun. I love getting to talk about. I get brought on to talk about like religious stuff a lot, which is fun. That's my job. But talking about movies is way more fun, and the stakes are a lot lower. So this was a good time.
Cool. Thanks for joining us. All right, we'll see you all next time.
Watch out for frogs, everybody.
Watch out for frogs.